Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending, and many, many thanks to ASBNB for their continued support of biochemistry and molecular biology education. They are continuous with that, and I love that they lead this group and that everyone participates to contribute and help each other. So today I'm going to talk about my experience with synchronous instruction in my first semester biochemistry course in the spring, and what some of the educational research studies show about synchronous instruction. My goal is to provide some practical guidance for you guys with some evidence for best practices for courses that are normally face-to-face. So my approach is not that we're going to make our online courses last forever. This is, here's what we're going to do in this time of the pandemic. And so in an effort to help me better understand your experience, I had planned a poll, but the way the meeting is set up, I think the poll will not work. And so I created a slide then. If I can get this now, I'm stuck. Okay. Well, the slide is not showing. So, and the poll was, which of the following have you used in a course with synchronous format? And it was lectures only, group work only, practice problems or review sessions only, office hours only, lectures and office hours, or sort of all of the above, lectures, office hours, group work. And what I imagined is I would get lots of answers of all of those. And so then it's clear that I'm not the only person present that has experience with synchronous instruction. So during this talk, I would encourage everybody to contribute to the chat, to ask comments or questions.
Rachel, I'm saying, can you try sharing your screen again? I think I was trying to show mine because I did set up a poll. So I sent it in a chat and I was trying to show, because like my account can show live results, but I can always send it after this meeting to everybody if they're interested to see how people.
Okay, oh, it kicked me off. Okay, let's try again.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay, can you see it now?
We can see your screen. Yep.
Okay, excellent. Okay, and then I'm changing now, so that's good. Okay, and so in that poll, I imagined that I would get, lots of experience. And so I want to encourage everyone to ask questions or put comments in the chat. Feel free to use your microphone to interrupt. I don't mind that at all. And so I want us first to think about what platform we use for synchronous instruction. And here's a list of common platforms. And for those of you that have used multiple platforms, what I would ask you to do in the chat is to put in there what's your favorite platform if you've used some of these different ones, and maybe a quick explanation of why that's preferred. I think that things that should be considered when we think about what platform to use is first, what is your university or your school going to support? And so if nothing, then I would look to other schools for support. So for example, we use Zoom at UIW. And so when I go to my Teaching for Center and Learning, there are all sorts of videos and explanations for Zoom that anybody can access, whether you are UIW faculty or not. And so I would borrow resources from other institutions, and there are some fantastic instructions out there for some schools. Also, I think we should consider what are easy for you to use as the instructor when you're delivering course content, and what's easy for your students to use. And so there's been a great debate, I think, about synchronous versus asynchronous instruction. I've certainly seen this at my university. So I wanted to start with this quote by Rachell. And it says, "The thing is, there's nothing inherently wrong with asynchronous learning, nor with synchronous learning. Each is suited to solve the goal of the learning, the characteristics of the learners, and the course format." And I thought this was sort of a great way to approach this idea of, we're not saying one is better than the other. We're saying we need to think about our situation with our students and our course, and we need to decide what fits well with that. We'll keep in mind as we go through that things like course size, student level, accessibility, those things should drive our course design. So the question that we asked is, why choose synchronous instructions in your course? And there's some educational research studies that show that synchronous synchronous instruction raises student satisfaction, leading to increase in effort engagement of those students. It shows that it provides a social side of education. Everyone, I think, during this time needs some social interaction, especially when we're physical distancing. It can provide immediate feedback, where research has shown that that immediate feedback definitely increases student performance compared to those that have delayed feedback. It encourages the exchange of multiple perspectives. That's known to lead to innovation, creativity, and diplomacy. And it enhances dynamic interactions that are necessary for long-term learning and retention. One educational group by Mann and colleagues found that students perceived that they learned more, earned higher grades, and had increased opportunities to connect when synchronous instruction was used. And so I think when I think about my own students and their perceptions, I can't help but think if they feel better about what they're doing, they're going to engage more, they're going to learn better because they're motivated to work on this course content. So those same studies address disadvantages and when synchronous instruction is not ideal. And what we know is that when technology is unavailable or unstable, that's an issue. When the environment is not suitable, I think we've all had students that maybe, or even some of us, that didn't have an isolated space to work. And so participating in a live session becomes very difficult. And finally, that timing is not flexible. For those with changing work schedules or sick families, we need some flexibility. And so I primarily address these issues in my course by taking certain logistics in my instructional design. And I'll talk about those as I give you some more details in just a minute. So I think at this point, we all can recognize that there are benefits to synchronous learning. And the question now is, how do we incorporate that into our course design? And so I write here, synchronous course design. And for the purpose of this talk, I broke my strategy into 4 major steps. Now, the small number of steps no way implies that this process is simple or easy. I was just trying to sort of organize it in a way that would fit my thought process. So let's work through these steps. First is to understand your students' limitations. Second is to know your limitations. Third is to outline the design of your face-to-face course and then assign each item in that outline as something you could do synchronously or asynchronously. And then finally, to plan the synchronous delivery to engage students. So we'll go through each of these in more details. I'll start with step 1 in understanding your students. So I think we all know that communication with our students is clear. I think Erica also hit on this in her introductory talk today. And that one of the biggest take-home messages that I got from the spring semester was that is definitely harder when you're not regularly seeing these students face-to-face. So before we went online, I had about a week to prepare. I surveyed my students through our course learning management system. In our case, that's Blackboard, so that I could better understand their situation and their needs. And so here's where I was going to do another poll with you guys. And so since that poll is not available, I'll just tell you the questions that I was going to ask. And the first question is, what type of electronic devices do all your students typically have? So if you were guessing, would you say that all your students have cell phones? Would you say they all have computers? Would you say they all have a computer with a camera? And so for my students, what I found is everybody had a cell phone. And that everybody had either a computer or an iPad. And so that allowed me pretty good flexibility in some of the design of my course. The next question that I asked my students is about their internet access. So if you were guessing, typically what percentage of your students have internet access at home? And so I was quite shocked by this. In my case, 100% of my students had internet access. Now that internet access varied pretty dramatically in bandwidth, in speed, in stability. And so while it's nice that they all have internet, what we did see is that along the way, that internet was not always ideal. The next was, what percentage of your students can attend course sessions during the regularly scheduled class time? And so when I polled my students, I had about 40 students that I was working with for this particular class, and 37 of them could attend during the regular class time, and about 3 of them could not regularly attend. So they could attend some, but not always. And that was because of changes in their jobs, or I had a student that had to take care of siblings that were no longer in school. And so those circumstances we want to be careful with, and we want to make sure that whatever we do in our design is going to accommodate those students as well. And then finally, I asked my students what was their biggest concern in this transition to remote learning. And so I put a few of the comments, oh, there's the polls. We'll skip those now. So I put a few of the comments here, and I'll give you just a second to read through them. And my guess would be that a lot of these are very similar to what your students were concerned about. And that was, how do we communicate if we need help? How do I interact? You know, if I'm not face-to-face, how am I going to learn in a difficult course? And they all think biochemistry is difficult. And how are we going to understand and things be clear if I'm not getting explanations? And so I had this in mind, and based on this feedback, I started leaning towards synchronous sessions for lecture and trying to mimic what I was doing in some of my face-to-face sessions with recorded synchronous sections, so that students that couldn't make the synchronous session would have access to a recorded session later that they could go through. It also maybe would give students another place to go back to when they watched a synchronous section. They might want to go back and revisit some of the explanations. But before I finalized those course plans, I thought about other things, and I was not very good at this, but I think this is an important step for all of us, is know your limitations and what is reasonable for you to do. So as a faculty member, we're pretty terrible about doing this, I think, and sort of carving out our own space. And so I thought there were 3 things that we should really consider, and the first one was scheduling class time. And so if you had the option, could you meet during your regularly scheduled class time? And this was another polling place. And so I assumed that some of you would say yes, and some of you would say no, and some of you would say sometimes. So then the follow-up question is, for those of you that are thinking no or sometimes, is there another scheduled time that works for you? And if so, can your department for the fall semester alter the class schedule so that that time fits your family schedule or your spouse's schedule and that sort of thing? So there are a couple of benefits, I think, to scheduling that class time. And that is, it ensures that students are dedicating specific times to your class. It sets a schedule for you. And I also found that it made establishing assessment times a bit easier for me. The second idea is accommodating office hours. So when we went remote, I decided what times that I would be available for office hours. And I made a huge list, and I set up a doodle poll, and I asked my students to complete that doodle poll and tell me what times they were available. And then I set up a new series of office hours instead of what I was doing face-to-face, based on the times when most students were available. And what this allowed me to do was minimize the number of one-on-one or individual appointments that I had to set up, because I could get larger number of students there at once. And because people's schedules were a little more flexible, there were lots of times where I could get 15 students that were all free at the same time. And the final idea is to think about how much time you have to develop online materials. Now, this is maybe less of an issue for the fall semester, but in the spring, I did not have time to pre-record lectures for my students. I had some pre-recorded lectures that I used with my face-to-face class, and so I certainly kept those. But I didn't have time to develop new content covering sort of explanations for topics. And so I spent a lot of time on assessment and designing questions and making sure that I was doing assessment in a way that would really assess my students and what they learned. And so it was a balance for me, and I chose to do assessment. So now that I've considered what my limitations are, along with my students, limitations, then I think about what can synchronous instruction be used for? And I think that these are all things that we know: lectures, group work, practice review sessions, or office hours. In my face-to-face classes, I typically annotate the slides, I post them, I show models, I walk through animations with my students, we do practice problems or interactive group activities. And so it's possible to replicate all those things remotely. But for lecture sections, they should be limited in time, and the appropriate time is debatable for these remote sessions. And I saw lots of places no more than 60 to 90 minutes in a Zoom format was ideal. And that it's also important to incorporate some participation responses during these sessions. For group work, groups can be random or pre-assigned. We saw Erica talk about how she likes to pre-assign. There are benefits to both. And so what I saw in the references that I looked at is the ideal number is 3 to 4 members per group. And while that is manageable for some, if you had a class of 100 and you put people in groups of even 4, that's 25 different groups. I think it's not reasonable that you'll make it to 25 different groups during an activity or a session. So if you have TAs or lead students, that might help. But if not, then it may be that you need larger groups, and then you have to give them very defined sort of guides as to how they're going to run that larger group. And then finally, for practice or review sessions and office hours, I don't see those two things as very different. But my experience in the spring was that my students saw them as very different things. And so I got lots of students to show up for practice or review sessions, and I got a few students to show up for office hours. And so while we did essentially the same thing by calling it a practice or review session, they were much more engaged because they felt like the outcomes would be much better for them. So I want to move on to step 3 and look at my course outline. So this is 1 week snapshot, an example of what a weekly activity list might look like for my class. You can see that there are some quizzes here, there's some homework, there's some explanations in lecture, and there's some group work. And so considering student limitations, my limitations, the synchronous instruction options that I had to use, and deciding what parts could students learn independently pretty easily and what parts would they struggle and have frustrated experiences with. And then after thinking of those things, I assigned to each of these items in my outline either asynchronous or synchronous. And then I considered what synchronous features to use for each of those items. And so here's a long list of synchronous features, and we've used some of these today. So audio, video, text chat, interactive whiteboard, application sharing like PowerPoint or maybe YouTube, instant polling, emotion icons, breakout rooms, or recording a session. So those are all things that we can do that enhance or help our synchronous features. And so while we don't have to use all of these in our course, we certainly could use some combination of them. And I'll give you an example. In a class session with 200 students, you may assess learning with polling and have them use the chat, while in a class of only 20 students, you might use flashcards on the screen, or the students could just use their audio to ask questions out loud, and that would work. And so again, these are going to depend on class size and your students. And so I'll just give you an example of what I did in the spring. And so for me, audio started off to decrease the background noise, and the students learned to use their space bars on their keyboards to speak and to ask questions. And I teach by asking questions of my students. And so there were a lot of awkward, long pauses, but eventually a student will speak up to answer a question. We use the video off. And so while it is really nice to see student reactions and to see their faces during an explanation session, it reduced the bandwidth for lots of students. And so the internet stability was better when everybody had their video off except me. I actually turned the text chat off. I was worried that text would be distracting for students and that they would miss out on those brief explanations during the session if they were trying to chat with another student, even if it was about content. While I didn't use the interactive whiteboard, I used PowerPoint slides in application sharing where I annotated them or I wrote in those. And so instead of the whiteboard, I just created blank PowerPoint slides, and I could draw a picture or explain a concept or work a problem on one of those blank slides. I certainly used instant polling, and that was great for assessing informally what students were figuring out, what they were still having difficulty with. I didn't use the emotion icons, but I did use breakout rooms for group work with detailed guidance, and I recorded sessions, again, for those students that couldn't make the synchronous sessions. And so there's some educational studies that say, here's the more effective ways to use synchronous instruction. And so some of these we have heard throughout the day today. So Erica certainly touched on many of these things. And I want to not read the list to you. I'll give you a second to look at the list. But I want to lead you on to the next part, which is interactions between students and instructors. And I think that we call this engagement, and it is really one of the things we really must be very careful about, and we must be very diligent and purposeful about when we're teaching remotely. And so that is the last plan, is to plan to engage students during the synchronous instruction. And so some of the ways that we can do this is, if you're using PowerPoints, is to write or draw or annotate those PowerPoint slides. It works very nicely in PowerPoint because you can actually save those slides and upload them, which I do for my students. You can give chalk talks where you can, if you don't have a nice fancy iPad, you can just put up a whiteboard and you can walk them through a mechanism or a problem that you would have done in class to help explain things. You can use flashcards for quick informal assessments. So you might ask a question and have students hold up a flashcard. This I could imagine working really well with drawing structures. So everybody draw me alanine, and then let's talk about what properties of alanine are important, right, as practice. Embedded polls. We can wait for audio responses to questions. We can let students ask and answer questions in the chat. And so the chat in Zoom is saved as well. So that gives us the power to go back and reassess or answer questions that weren't answered. And then breakout groups with well-defined tasks. So in breakout groups, it's important to give strong guidance. For my class, I have activities, and there's always a worksheet with that activity. And so the great breakout group, everybody has the worksheet or the activity printed out or on their computer, and they can work through it together and talk about those details. What's nice about an activity sheet or a worksheet is that students that cannot participate in that breakout session still have the ability to walk through that worksheet and get the same content or the same practice that the students in the synchronous session would get. And then student screen sharing for presentations. We did this a bit as well, where a student would share their screen and they would give an explanation for a particular topic or concept. And so I thought I would share just a few responses. So this is at the end of the semester, the best part comment after synchronized instruction. And I'll give you a second to look through these. And with these in mind, I wrote a list of tips and take-homes from my experience. And so one of the big things that came up with my students is that students have a difficult time staying organized when they're not having the class time or the class reminders. And so when they go to class, somebody says, hey, did you study, are you studying for that quiz next week? And they go, oh, wait, quiz next week, yeah. And so I found that weekly reminders were very helpful for students. I sent them on Sundays. I said, here's the things we're going to do this week. Here's what we're doing in each of our sessions. Here's the things outside of class you're going to do. But this also made me think about students' workload. It was one of the big complaints that I had from my students about some of their other classes, is that when other classes went predominantly asynchronous, the students felt like it took them more time to get through course content, kind of trying to figure it out on their own. And that's something that they could read a book and take 20 or 30 minutes to try to understand, I could explain to them in 5 minutes in a face-to-face call. And so those, I think, ideas of students and their workload and keeping them on a schedule are important as we move forward. Recording synchronous sessions is necessary but in chunks is even better. So in Zoom, you can stop recording and restart recording, and it saves it as a different file. I could title those files based on content, and it was very easy then for students to go back and find something. The scheduled class time made assessments easier. It was much easier to impose time limits for assessments when they were scheduled for a class period. I didn't have to worry about conflicts with other classes or conflicts with jobs because they already planned to be in my class during those times. And then finally, I would say that students need to be forced to engage in some aspect of course, or they will often opt out. Now, I didn't require attendance, but the students, I would say 90% of my students attended synchronous sessions all the time. And so I think they wanted that engagement. And so for some of them, I had to force them to engage. And whether that was office hours or the synchronous time, I reached out to those that were regularly not at synchronous sessions to make sure that they were getting what they needed and that they weren't being sort of hindered by circumstances that they could not control. So with that, I thought we would leave chats or look at chats or comments or questions in the chat, I should say. And so one of the things I wanted to ask to start off this sort of discussion period is, who is distracted by the chat? When you sit in a meeting or you do a Zoom call, are you distracted by the chat, and do you lose sight of what the speaker is saying? So I'm seeing in the chat, lots of chat can be distracting. It was one of the reasons I chose to turn mine off, but then I worried that my students were missing out on some interaction behind the scene. And so does anybody have suggestions on what's the happy medium between those?
So my main concern about using chat during lecture is that I won't be able to cover as much ground that I want to. And so that's been my main problem. I can manage the chat very well, but I find myself just, not finishing up where I've already, earmarked to finish. So that's my main problem.
That's a great point. One of the things I wondered is, could I take those chat questions and put them in a discussion board? And I've never used discussion boards. Well, maybe a long, long time ago. But I'm not great about checking discussion boards. Has anybody tried to do something along those lines?
I've tried the discussion board things with different classes, and they never, somebody just put that in chat, they never use them.
They don't use them. Okay, good to know. Thank you, Mike.
I did wonder if, Zoom is primarily meant for kind of face-to-face. Has anybody tried more of a webinar kind of platform? I even thought I made myself an account on Twitch, which is what people use for streaming video games. But there, it can be you talking, doing your content, and then all of the interaction is in chat, is in written. Or I guess maybe I think YouTube Live would be something like that. But like you're in a webinar, and then anything that I want to say back, to you, Rachel, Professor Booth, has to go in the chat. Right.
So then I think that what I worry about is that I can't talk and then look at a chat in a very streamlined way. But maybe I could practice. It's a good point. You can with Zoom. I haven't done this. I tried and I had a hard time. You can with Zoom, you can stream to YouTube, which was valuable for a few students that had trouble with internet access. But I worry about privacy issues with students asking questions or students being shown on the YouTube video. And so I decided that was not a good idea.
Okay, so if we can have people, sorry, Rachel. Thank you. Excellent talk. I appreciate it. I already got 5 more ideas, so I'm good.